Hello, everybody. This talk is titled 1001 Sources of Bias in Arabic Computational Linguistics. I am Professor Nizar Habash. I'm a computer science professor at NYU Abu Dhabi, and my background has a mix of degree in linguistics and in computer engineering, and then my PhD was in computer science. I work primarily in Arabic language technologies, Arabic natural language processing, but originally started as a machine translation person. So a lot of examples today will be coming out of machine translation, just in case you wonder why I'm obsessed with that problem. And I'm also the director of the Computational Approaches to Modeling Language Lab here in New York University, Abu Dhabi. You can follow our lab and check out all of the work that we're doing here. Here's all the relevant link for social media, etc. And of course, all of this work could not happen without a wonderful team of people. So I just want to do a nod to all of their support and effort over the last few years we've been around. Okay, so when we talk about bias, I want to contextualize this into the bigger conversation that's going on today on bias in artificial intelligence in general. And bias generally refers to, in this particular context, to anomalies in the output of AI systems that are due to prejudice assumptions in the algorithms used in these systems or prejudices in the training data used to build them, right? So, which means that sometimes they will reflect human bias, but sometimes they may actually be surprising, at least in the logic that they lead to, although they're still biased. So famous examples, if you're not kind of aware of this bigger problem these days, things were like, for example, the Amazon recruiting algorithm that made stronger preferences for men over women. And it turns out that it was basing its preference based on the historical data where men were preferred. You know, there 60% or more of the employees were men. So the system learned to replicate that kind of distribution and then picked up signals, even when it doesn't say what the gender of the person is, it picked up signals like being famously like the women's chess team captain. That becomes something that the AI system learned to model the distribution that preferred the men again. So they stopped using this when this was uncovered. Other examples are, commercial health decision algorithms that were shown in the US to be biased against Black patients, ironically producing the odd assumption that African-American patients tend to be healthier because they don't need in historical record as much attention. Of course, they were not able to afford it to start with, right? So it ends up replicating kind of the social bias in the data, right? So this is kind of a bigger concept that a lot of folks in AI and in natural language processing computational linguistics are basically trying to deal with. Our conferences more recently started asking us to put statements related to ethical practices and the effect of what we do in those contexts, kind of as part of this heightened awareness. Now, let me give you some examples from Arabic machine translation, since I'm going to move you toward the conversation in Arabic specifically. And so this is actually something that I encountered almost about 15 years ago during a public demo at a famous US company that did machine translation systems. And the example was actually انتحاري ثاني يفجر نفسه في بغداد اليوم, but the translation that came out was a second Palestinian suicide bomber exposed himself in Baghdad today. So the word Palestinian was just completely hallucinated. And I noticed this in the demo. The person who was running the demo was not an Arabic speaker. He was actually quite a famous, respected Indian scholar who was working on machine translation for lots of different languages. And he was just, يتغنى can be the beauty of this sentence. Isn't it so syntactically well formed? We are so proud. Look, Palestinians were the second, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, but why would a Palestinian do this in Baghdad? Second time, that makes no sense. So, and then we look at the origin, and in fact, you can imagine what happened here. Basically, that the AI system had, in those times, it was what's called statistical machine translation. And it would basically try to weigh sentences by, the probability of the next word, depending on the context it appears in. And it just seems that if you put Palestinian before suicide and bomber, you increase the probability of the sentence. So it sounded more fluent. It's kind of interesting about how people maybe think too, right? Just this kind of silly repetition of and parroting. In 2022, this is gone. So success, over 15 years, we managed to improve this. Now, here's another example from Dialectal MT. This is a different kind of a problem where, you get output like this. This is actually an example from my Syrian PhD student, Wael Saloom, who worked on this problem. And you get just, garbage, basically, just nothing, is recognized. This has actually improved, but it's not perfect yet. And the big problem here is that machine translation systems don't see enough of this data. They don't see enough examples of carefully translated parallel, dialectal Arabic and English. And as a result, the quality of translation is really suboptimal. This is kind of important. I mean, I always insist on the importance of translation from the dialect because lots of people today on social media will want to see what you're saying to your friends or like something that you write in another language or hear about you talk about yourself. And they are unable to do this with these technologies that are kind of suboptimal. This was also a funny, famous example from a while back where Google Translate was accused of supporting Hosni Mubarak's regime, where if you translate from English to Arabic, I respect Egypt's future president, it says, أحترم الرئيس المصري حسني مبارك في المستقبل. I don't know, this sentence is a bit ironic in some way with the في المستقبل part, adding to the description of it. But here again, similar like to the Palestinian suicide bomber, Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak, right? These kind of repetitions are kind of consistent in that way, and that would be a bias also. This has improved. I'll finish, I think, two more actually. This one got a lot of attention in our field also because it actually made the news, where Israeli police arrested a Palestinian who wrote on Facebook "Isabbahum," and the translation that was done to Hebrew said attack them or hurt them, to hurt them. And of course, this was kind of confusing. I mean, I went to conferences where people were discussing like what went wrong. And the reason it's interesting is because we've shifted in the field toward what's called neural model and deep learning models that are much more powerful. They're actually a lot more successful than previous models that we had. But as a result, they don't give you the ability to investigate and be able to manipulate, without enough, you don't have that ability in the same way because they're just a lot more complex. And the suspicion here is that Isabbahum is dialectal, it's a particular usage, nothing was seen in the training data, it tried to match it with something. The best guess is that it's close to Yitbahum, for example, or something like this. It could have gone through a transfer through another language like English before it got to Hebrew. So lots of things could actually have caused this. The 2021, a little better. Hopefully it will not get anybody arrested. The guy was released, by the way, immediately after this was uncovered. But it kind of makes you like, why is Israel hiring people who don't speak Arabic to arrest people who speak? I mean, arrest somebody for the real reason, at least, that they can stand for, but this is BS. So this is still is a failure, actually. And again, lots of other complications caused it. Now I'm going to get to the part that I'm going to focus a lot more on today, which is a still failure in 2022. There is kind of a gender bias that is, in Google Translate and machine translation in general. I should not be picking on Google, but they're the best really to look at in that space. So when you put I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, you always get ana tabib wa ana mumarrida, right? So, for these guys, it's perfect, but not everybody would be happy with it, right? So you can imagine what the reason is today, right? So people say, well, it's images, repetitions, reflecting the data. But, this of course doesn't tell us like, how do we actually solve this problem? And here I'll be talking to you about some work that we've done here in the Camel lab on how to actually come up with a solution to this problem. But so when we talk about these biases, I promised 1,001. I will not deliver 1,001. It's just a metaphor here, exaggerations. But we're going to look at different aspects. So is it the language itself that's the problem? Is it the culture? Is it the data size, nature distribution? Is it the algorithms? Is it just research quality and quantity, or is it the market? And I'll say a little bit about all of these different things. And in fact, all of them are connected with each other. It's hard to kind of tease apart one thing and say, this is the only reason, fix it, and everything will be okay. For the rest of this, I will talk about gender bias, and not because it is the only problem or the most important problem, although it's quite a significant problem, but we have to focus on something to discuss it, maybe to understand this bigger patterns. Hopefully it will help us with other things to solve too. So is it language? Is it Arabic? Is Arabic problematic? No, it's not, of course. This problem happens with many other languages. But interestingly, for other languages, there is ongoing solutions, and people are trying to solve this, maybe perhaps a bit more than Arabic. We're a bit behind. I put some examples here where, the ambiguity is in the other language. And then when you go to English, so this is, if you go from Persian, it doesn't have gender, to English, the O, it could be, she or he. So now Google allows you to see these options, and then you can choose, what's being said. But when you take a language that's more like Arabic in that regard, like, my friend is a doctor, in the Spanish system that they translate from English, it would actually say, amiga and amigo is doctora, right? So it will generate the forms for you. In Arabic, it still doesn't do that. It's not an option that it provides. I know actually from a presentation that some folks from Google had done that they've been exploring playing with this, but it was hard. That was about 3 years ago that they said this, in 2019 during the gender bias workshop where we presented our work for the first time. But Arabic, of course, is not completely straightforward and easy little bunny when it comes to working with NLP. It has its own set of really interesting problems. So one of them is just the high degree of ambiguity in the text from the lack of diacritical marks that are optional, basically. So you could have a word like this that could be بِعُقَدِنَا وَبِعَقْدِنَا وَبِعَقْدِنَا وَبِعَقْدِنَا, it just kind of all come together. There's in standard Arabic about 7 different diacritizations or so, and 3 different core meanings per word out of context. Now, this is kind of a problem when you're, of course, analyzing Arabic, but it could be, of course, an advantage, one could argue. When I'm generating Arabic, if I make a mistake, is it a contract or a psychosis? It doesn't really matter. Here, honey, here's a necklace. Here is some psychosis for you, right? I mean, maybe she will figure it out on her own in that case, and it will be, resolved. But, when you're analyzing, of course, it is a bigger problem. Arabic also has a very high degree of morphological richness. And this is separate from the problem of ambiguity. So in ambiguity, you see a word, and this word could be read in many different ways. In richness, when you see a word that you have never seen before, it may actually be related to a word that you've seen before. Think from a machine learning point of view or from the computer, but you've never seen that word and you don't know the relationship between these words to be able to abstract how to model it. So for example, a verb in Arabic would have about 5,400 inflected forms. That number for a linguist is jarring, right? It's much higher than you expect, because often when we, as linguists, we look at these tables of the person, gender, number, aspect, maybe, that seems like, simple enough. But when you're looking at written Arabic, there's also all the clitics that are attached that are often not in those books of 500 verbs of Arabic. They don't list, this can have a wa and a fa and a future particle and all the possible pronouns at the end. But all of them actually in written form happen, and they can create additional ambiguities with other words, right? Think waw jim dal could be wajada or could be wa jadda fil amal, for examul, or wa jadd fulan, right? So there are lots of ambiguities that are resulted from this. And this is, of course, an Arabic related issue. In the context of gender, Arabic is such a fun space to work with also. I mean, you all know this, I assume, for this particular conference, but just in case, to kind of think about it from the point of view, how do I teach a machine, maybe perhaps even a non-native speaker of Arabic? There is a couple of issues of how do we, manage agreements and expression of gender in Arabic. So if I look at an example like this, like سكنت الموسيقية الطرشاء في 3 مدن شهيرة, and a couple of observations. So one of them is that things like agreement, for example, of rational or human versus non-human, rational, irrational. In Arabic, when you are irrational or mal'aqil, your agreement has to be exact in terms of gender and number, but with things that are irrational, then you go in the plural with the feminine singular. So that's something that has to be modeled. But also additionally, you get things like reverse gender agreement. This is like, the numbers that would look like the feminine numbers agree with masculine and the opposite way. And then of course, there is the expression of gender itself. If everything was ta marbuta, alif ta, ya noon, and nothing, then it would be much simpler. But you take words like mudun, for example, it's plural. Technically, it's feminine plural because it's the plural of Medina. But on the surface, on the look of it, it looks like a regular masculine noun, right? So, and from a machine point of view, the signal that comes, the feature in the word, can be distracting in trying to basically model these things. Now, this is important when we're generating Arabic, because we want to make sure we generate the adjectives and, verb agreements properly, right? So I'll take a little note here because this was kind of fun to investigate as part of the work that we did on, gender neutrality and gender neutral pronouns. Because one solution could be, forget about the gendered language. Can you just get rid of the gender? What aspects of Arabic can be gender neutral? So some things are natively gender neutral, like pronouns like ana, nahnu, huma, and tuma are always, ambiguous. But also in the written form, kaf, ta, alif, ba, kaf is actually ambiguous, kitabuka, kutabuki. So that kind of flies under the radar of written form. It could be, kind of equalizing in that case. And then, but then there are sometimes you could actually kind of manipulate constructions instead of saying ana sa'id jiddan, ana sa'ida jiddan, to say ana kulli sa'ada or hissu bis-sa'ada, which become gender neutral in that case. So we actually started thinking of this problem in the context of a chatbot, an Egyptian chatbot called Batta that we developed here a while back, who tries to guess your gender based on your name and then talk to you in the proper form that matches what Batta thinks your gender is, right? Other tricks like al-usm al-kareem instead of ma usmuka, ma usmuki, which of course itself passes the under the radar a little bit, but not when it's pronounced. But these are really limited. We can't really go too far with these kind of things. Things other people try, we see more and more of is, this parenthetical, parenthesizing the tamarbuta, or adding multiple forms, or adding the slash tamarbuta. So these are all kind of techniques that are currently being explored by people. My approach about this is not to tell people what to do, but let the culture decide how it's going to manage. Over time, things will stabilize and some things will become more common than others. But you can see this is very similar to a lot of things that are happening in other European languages. This is a global trend in a way. And also to the extreme of it, not just to say extreme, to this natural evolution of it, if you say, for example, work that's currently being explored in places like EXAL, for example, to come up with completely new pronouns, like instead of antum and antunna, it's antumunna. And you get like Eid Saeed wa kul aam wa antumunna bi khair. It's, this, like the French problem recently of having a new pronoun that people are, calling for the destruction of the, French language. I would imagine Majama' al-Lugha al-Arabiyya would be pulling their hair when they look at stuff like this, and there are more examples of this kind that are currently explored. Again, people are playing with language, and I think it's extremely healthy, and Arabic needs more of it, in fact. So is it culture and is it data size, nature, and distribution? I'm going to talk about these two together, right? Because I think the culture generates the data, the power in the culture, people who have power will generate more of the data, etc. So these are not completely separate from each other. So the general attitude in AI and in language processing is that generally bigger is better. But of course, when you have societal power, those who have access to machines, who have access to literacy, who have access to time, right, they basically generate more data. And by the nature of that, decide what the voices of the data, will be reflecting. One really interesting thing happened in the Arab world. In the last 10 years or so, there was this incredible explosion in social media. The amount of text that's written in Arabic today, in the dialects, for example, all different dialects, is much more than in standard Arabic. Now, you could say that's a bad thing. I think it's actually interesting that Arabic is finding a new breathing space instead of being suffocated into certain pathways of only its expression that are allowed. But now we find a lot more people are able to actually talk about themselves and share things. So this will affect, of course, what that means in terms of data when it comes to what we would call, unsupervised models, where you just get text and the system learns the fluency of the text, but it doesn't have the additional, let's say, translations or additional annotations. But the big idea here, of course, is that when you have power in society, that power recreates and sustains itself through this indirect way of adding more data. That data is used in the models, gives it more power again and again, right? And even when we talk about data, we have to also, not all data are equal, just as I just said, actually. Having a lot of text, let's say, is one aspect. This would be raw data. But there are other kind of data that are, let's say, parallel data, where you have the data and its equivalent translation, let's say, or some additional annotations on it. And these, of course, the more you add in the sequence, the more annotations, the more commissioning, creation of lexicons, etc. That's time. Time means money. You have to get people to donate their time, donate their effort to create it. And guess again, it relates to power again. Who has the money and the time to be doing this, etc. So it's definitely connected. Not mentioning copyright ownership issues, which are always kind of blocking our process. Currently in my field, there's a lot of interest in open sourcing, sharing resources so that people can add to them and share them. And as academics, we are in a privileged place, of course, where we can afford to do this. And it's good for our jobs to say, look, we made this available and look at the impact it has, right? Whereas, I understand it in companies, they want to, have monopolies and make money, etc. And that's also, important and understandable. And I want to kind of relate to the previous point I said about the language. So, morphologically rich languages like Arabic or Spanish, etc., these are also more demanding when it comes to data. You need to see more examples so you can build better model, because some cases you will not see as much as other words as a result. But my main message here is that, if we really want to try to change the world using technology for good, we don't do it by just simply modeling the world. We need other things to do. And, more balanced data could help, debias the model. So that's kind of an impression that a lot of people believe in and have been pushing for in big companies. And this gets me to the 1001, just a little kind of cute thing I want to just share. When I was thinking about this problem and Arabic and gender bias, I couldn't, of course, escape thinking of King Shahryar and his, problem with women, if we can call it that. The man had issues, of course, and kind of thought of, this big book that I enjoyed reading since I was a teenager, and I go back to from time to time. It's just really fascinating to look at it. If you have not read the original, you definitely should. There's a modern feminist interpretation of the Arabian Nights that looks at this as basically kind of like Shahrazad basically reprogrammed him. He had a mental health issue, an obsession based on a set of experiences that he and his brother and God knows what had. And she basically tells him lots of stories that involves, women of all kinds. So it's like wonderful, strong women who were protecting their men. And there's also stories of women who were, nasabat, troublemakers, who were, creating trouble. There's every kind of man, every kind of woman. And, and the idea here is that this was kind of a way of debiasing him near the end, right? I mean, that's kind of a happy ending kind of thing. They lived happily together at the end. Oddly, in the story, they have 3 children by the end. I don't know where they had the time to do this while telling all these stories. But anyways, but of course, even when you read the book, you would notice that such universal balance, although maybe on certain aspect could be attained if you say that. I'm just making this up, obviously, I did not count. But there were also traces of other kind of biases. The book has been accused of being racist, particularly toward African, characters in it. There is some amount of xenophobia. So you could say, well, every time we try to balance, are we really able to balance in every possible dimension, right? Oh, I missed this. So I think of this now as basically, he is an AI model that had some history that is bad, not good enough data. And Shahrazad is this programmer who's basically fixing him, right? So I missed this in animations. Okay, I'll give you a couple of examples of data that I worked with. that I've used that shows these kind of aspects of the bias in the data. And this was really just shocking to actually look at. I've worked with this particular corpus called the basic traveling expressions for some time. And before I started thinking seriously about the gender bias problem, I didn't even notice. I mean, okay, I did notice that a lot of the sentences are men talking. I didn't look carefully. I'll be honest, right? And we were really more interested in the translation between, English and Arabic and English, and it has also French parallel and Japanese parallel data. It originally started in Japan, this particular corpus. And when we looked at the Arabic data set, we found about 72% or so are gender neutral. So first person, second person speakers. Oh, by the way, this corpus is all about things people say when they're traveling. Like, I'd like a cup of coffee, please. Or I need a room with a window on the sea to the ocean or something like this. So it's all, short sentences of that kind that are used, of course, to help travelers when they translate, to translate what they need. But then about 26% of the sentences were masculine specific, first or second person, and 1% were feminine specific. So 26-1 is the ratio of the masculine to the feminine. And the feminine examples were things like, I'm a housekeeper, أنا مدبرة منزل, أنا ربة منزل, I'm a housewife, أنا سكرتيرة, إني مطلقة, right? So even I am divorced, a man in this corpus cannot say I'm divorced. It's not allowed, cannot be a secretary, Of course, I'm making it about men, poor men. No, but it is, in a way, this is kind of an example of the bias that was in the data. Now, you could say, what happened? Why? And I tell you, from having been in this field for 20-something years, this idea was not on people's mind at the time. It's really a blind spot, for whatever it's worth. And I think people were thinking, if I have money and I can translate 20,000 sentences, do I want to translate half of them 2 ways or translate all of them 1 way? And they went with the all of them 1 way, right? I think that's kind of at the end part of it, right? Perhaps the culture of science having less women in it would have pointed this out and said, hey, what's going on? What is this, right? Now that's also changing to the better, to the best. Okay, so that's an example. I'll give you another really interesting example that I discovered as part of this research, which is an example of AI feeding into itself in a really crazy loop that has no human involved in it in a way. So this is and this is gone now. This was in July 2021, and it was fixed by August 21. If you put I, capital M, dot, I only discovered this, I was writing a sentence, Google Translate was fast, and I'm like, what does that mean? Makes no sense. And so because the sentence is short, the context is not strong enough, and then the model just ended up generating something garbage. For whatever reason it is. Now, the interesting thing, you'd say, okay, good, alhamdulillah, August 21 problem is gone, except when you search for it quoted, you find there's 4,470 instances of this actually existing. Well, how could that be? What happens is people use Google Translate to translate text. When they translate garbage in, garbage out, becomes the garbage in that the system says, oh, I have parallel data, look at me. I'm going to use it to generate more examples. Right? So this Wayo wal Wuluj will be here for some time until it fades out of existence, but it will still be there in essence, right? Very odd, but that's another kind of aspect that complicates our job as technologists, trying to understand, what data to use, how to determine that the data is clean. There's actually competitions to determine whether, kind of like, is this actually automatically generated or real? Similarly, like, people do it in things that are more obvious, like, is this a bot, tweeting bot or human writing on Twitter? Okay, so can we just simply fix AI and with more diverse data? I don't think it's actually going to be the case. I think we need a bit more control, particularly. And this gets us to the algorithms, right? And it's really complicated. Not the algorithms, like the situation even of fixing the algorithm is complicated. I'll show you, going back to the example that we started with. So I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, أنا طبيب أنا ممرضة. Say the world is biased, the models are biased, the data is biased, the models are biased. But even with all of that, we still have a system that I would call a gender-unaware single output system, right? The system doesn't know my gender or my gender preferences when I say I am. It has no reason. I mean, Google knows a lot of things about me, right? Probably more than I imagine. But somehow in this context, they just are clueless. They don't know. And then they could have generated the multiple outputs, so that's why it's a single output system. Now you could say we should always generate multiple outputs. That's actually not practical in some context. Imagine the situation of speech-to-speech translation, and somebody says something, it's not going to generate two different versions. You have to have the human in the loop saying, are you this, are you that? But effectively, you need the single output system in that case. So this will continue to be a challenge. Now, some tactics people in the field have tried was to basically prime the system with information that would suggest it or to push it toward the right direction. Like saying, I'm a female doctor, or I'm a woman who is a doctor. You get actually some decent outputs, like ana tabiba, and the imra'a tabiba sounds like, oh my God, is that possible? That's really not what you want, but that's also what the English kind of implies in some way. They try the reverse, you get really weird output. And I'm a male nurse, أنا ممرضة ذكر. That sounds horrible. Or أنا رجل ممرضة, which, doesn't make a lot of sense. Or it could even be read, I'm the foot of a nurse, which doesn't make any sense either, right? So something is kind of odd here, right? Another thing that I find is that these systems are fragile. In this role, by the way, that I'm doing here, I'm kind of acting like almost like a psychologist to the AI system, giving it messages, seeing what it says to try to understand it. I'm going to use the word probing, but that's not the right word technically, because that's used in our field in a different way. That is, in principle, has similar case, but here I'm looking at the output. If you say I'm a nurse versus I am a nurse, you get different outputs, right? And this to me is just not very explainable. Why would that be? And again, it goes back to the lack of control in these systems. You have no guarantee that if you try this with other words, it would work the same way. So I'm a doctor and I'm a doctor is in both cases ana tabib, right? So it's not necessarily consistent, right? So they're very fragile, gender unaware, and single output systems, and lack basically the control that we need to give them. Here's another kind of fun example that was fun to put together. It was English to Arabic translation, where it says, I worked as a political activist, a cook, a dancer, a nurse, an engineer, a driver, and a thief before I got married and became a mother, or same, before I got married and became a father, right? And you can see in some cases, the system actually picked up the relationship between the most gender-marked word, which was the last word intentionally, the mother versus father, and applied it. So say, عملت كناشطة سياسية وطاهية وراقصة وممرضة, right? And then, but then it flips. So in some aspects, they are actually, matching the gender. In some aspects, I guess راقصة ممرضة, if you could become a راقصة ممرضة and then become تصبح أبا بعد ذلك, so that's interesting life. And you could also, you cannot be a woman and be مهندس سائق لص either, right? So again, these are really just inconsistent. This kind of makes me think of a different kind of task of, grammatical error correction as a way of post-editing all of these systems, which is something we actually explored in our work. And so again, it's inconsistent. It doesn't use this information. I'm putting these two sentences next to each other. This is actually, just kind of to graphically show them next to each other in this case, but they were generated independently. Okay, is it research quality and quantity? Is it the market? I'll quickly say a couple of words. Of course, this is again connected to funding, publishing, and human resources, and who funds what, who, again, it's another variation on the power in society. For the longest time, when you look at the history of Arabic publications or publications on Arabic language processing, there was always stuff going on for the last 20-something years, but at some point after 9/11, these numbers shot up, and most of it was because of funding in the US and places like DARPA and other that funded research on Arabic, of course, for political reasons. But universities are involved, and I'll just kind of, conflict of interest, I guess, pointing out that when I was at Columbia, we did get funding to work on Arabic, basically from the government. But as a university, everything that we did was basically made publicly available and used across the Arab world, and had helped actually push that research. But this kind of creates, again, this aspect of ethics of this kind of work. I'm just putting some quotes here to give you a sense from the point of view of computational linguists and computer scientists, where I've had students who say, I want to work on language X, but I'm worried I will not get published, cited, or land a job. I've heard this many times about Arabic. I don't want to be pigeonholed in being an Arabic NLP person. That would hurt my career, potentials, etc. you know, and is this, you know, will it affect me being able to get more funding, etc. So these are concerns, and it basically affects how much work happens in that space. So I'm very happy with my decision to come to Abu Dhabi and work in NYU, because that gives me the freedom to work about this within my job and not have to worry about it as much. This is actually just a collection of stats that I got comparing Arabic and other languages. You know, Arabic is still relatively doing better than languages that are actually larger technically in usage than Arabic, like Hindi, for example. But, you know, compared to German and Chinese, you know, we're still behind. And there's a lot more work. The area is growing quite fast, actually. And last thing about the market, this was really a pleasure to find at one point that Twitter decided it will actually allow its user to specify the gender preference. They call it the feminine Arabic. So when you, instead of saying gharrid, blah, 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 you'd say gharridi. But you have to specify it, I believe, to be able to actually use it that way. So this is a place where the system is becoming gender aware, even though it's single output, right? Instead of saying gharrid / gharridi, it just says, what would you want me to say for you so that you're happy and you feel welcome to come here and tweet more, right? So maybe more companies will start picking that trend up. Okay, so I talked about problems, and I'll talk now about solutions that we've had. And I want to, you know, mention two of my colleagues here, Bashar Alhafni, who's actually on the call with me. He'll be demoing the work that he's doing. He's a PhD student here at New York University. And Huda Bamor, who's a colleague from Qatar, from Carnegie Mellon University, Qatar. And we've been working on this since 2019, this problem of the doctor and the nurse and the gender, kind of control for gender rewriting, we call it. So when we started this work, what we started with is the big question when you do research, which is, well, how will you know you succeeded? How will you know that you solved this problem? And well, we need to first collect data, at least not necessarily to say we're going to train the best system that is gender balanced, but at least to say, do I know what happens, in fact, in the data? Can I take a test set that's blind and evaluate on it so I can judge my progress? So we started with that sense of like, let me get some data that I can use. And initially, we started with just focusing on first-person speakers. So things with ana, you know, me, myself, I, and whether the speaker can be identified based on text, no speech, as being masculine, feminine, or both, in the grammatical gender sense, of course. And we needed parallel data, and this did not exist, right? So I want data that tell me masculine, feminine, masculine paired with each other. So we created this data, and all of this data is publicly available. You can just download it today after this talk if you see it. So what did we do? We ended up getting this really lovely corpus, well, a portion of an existing corpus called Open Subtitles, which are those subtitles you see when you watch American movies on Arabic in the Arab world. You know, all of the Arabic subtitles, these are publicly available, and they are already with their closed captions, the English translations of them. So we extracted, based on the English, the instances that says I, me, myself, mine. And we got a very large data set out of this. And we'd have things like what I'm showing you here, right? And what we did, we paid a bunch of our students to go in and annotate. If I see a sentence, can you tell me if you can determine the grammatical gender of the speaker, or if this is actually just a garbage case? There's no first-person speaker. This was a translation or a mistranslation that did not give us what we need. So things like ليس لدي مصلحة في هذا is B, meaning both. It's unclear, although there is definitely a first person. أطلق النار علي, also there is a first person, but it could be a man or woman. أنا غنية, أنا راحلة versus أنا مسلم وهندوسي, etc. Right? So these are masculine in that case, right? And when for the cases that are feminine or masculine, we translated them. So we commissioned the translation manually by the people who did the work. We asked them specifically not to change anything in the sentence other than the words that would be changed because of the gender. So أنا راحلة becomes أنا راحل, أنا غنية becomes أنا غني, أنا مسلم وهندوسي becomes أنا مسلمة وهندوسية, okay? And that's how we kind of generated this text. We're calling this the Arabic parallel gender corpus. This was, to my knowledge, to our knowledge, the first parallel gender corpus ever, actually. Even in the European languages that people have worked on, nobody had done this work. And it actually became, you know, a bit of a surprise, like, oh, you could do this. I'm like, yeah, why not, right? I mean, you have to be able to test it instead of taking, what other people would do is they would run the system and look at the output of the system post hoc and decide if it did well or didn't do well. But this kind of was a solution that we did here. We also included things like some items we tried to keep within the same lemma. So tabib becomes tabiba. You don't go tabib to doctora, for example. Just want to stay with the minimum change that happens in terms of the gender features, grammatical gender feature. And then things like and ab, we made the decision that this is gender marked, inherently, and you have to translate the lexical item in that case. So to ab, to ukht, and so on. We decided to avoid cultural biases and assumptions. So things like tilka zawjati, that's my wife, we decided would be B, not M. Could be a woman married to another woman. So that's kind of a decision that we went with. We decided also that all proper nouns are considered B. So we have no judgments if what you want to call yourself, right? And this is how we avoid dealing with the sabah problem, by basically making everybody a sabah, right? Effectively, you can choose to call anybody whatever you want. That's what they want to call themselves. The agreement was about 97% between the different annotators that we used, and it was very few ambiguous cases. So now in this particular corpus, we found about 91% were actually gender neutral in the first person speaker. Actually, that number was a bit high to me. I was surprised that it would be this high, but it kind of made sense when you look at all of the verb constructions that are first person is completely ambiguous. But the masculine sentences were twice as many as the feminine sentences. That's odd. There was no reason for this to be, right? I mean, this is, subtitles from movies. I mean, yes, there's maybe more male characters in movies. We know about the conversations about representation of women in Hollywood. This is about Hollywood, effectively, right? Because most of these were English movies that are translated to Arabic, but it was still kind of odd. Now, 1.4% of all the specific words, as opposed to the sentences, were actually gender marked. So that's kind of interesting. So this is like, think of a little pebble in your shoe. It's tiny, but it actually makes the big difference, right? The small number of cases that will shift your focus of what is this sentence about. So little here is really important when we do this. So what we did, we balanced the data, and we also did proper splitting of the data that is balanced between training, development, and testing. So we can do scientific experiments. We made this a standard for the set so that other people working with this data would follow us and can compare these numbers with each other. So at the end, we had almost 90,000 words, about 12,000 sentences in this first corpus that we did. Okay, and when we ran this through Google Translate, just funny, taking us back to the original problem, Google Translate has a 10-to-1 bias on those sentences, because now we can actually evaluate, and it's not just impressionistic on doctor and nurse. So the bias was actually very clear, 10-to-1 in those cases. And one of the feminine examples was, I'm anxious, ana mutawattira, or something like this. It always is feminine, for example, in Google Translate in those cases. We created also a synthetic corpus of all of the words that we have in our resources in the Camel lab, generated lots and lots of different small sentences in parallel so that we can feed it to the machine. So this is kind of a synthetic augmentation. This did not help a lot, unfortunately, because there wasn't really enough context for the models to learn. Now, more recently in 21, with the help of PhD students Bashar Alhafni, we expanded this to 80,000 sentences and almost over 500,000 words now. And we included first person and second person, right? We're getting greedy. So this is about me and you talking with each other, where you can have lots of things that can go in both directions. Like this example, I'm glad you made it home, dear. أنا سعيد. أنا سعيد بعودتك يا عزيزي. أنا سعيدة بعودتك يا عزيزي. أنا سعيد بعودتك يا عزيزتي. أنا سعيدة بعودتك يا عزيزتي. Right. So technically, all four combinations have to be generated to be able to say in this sentence, you don't really know, the speaker and the listener. Almost at the demo, I'll just give you the impression of the system that is currently under review that Bashar had developed. So we have an initial step that does gender identification of the word. And again, just to insist on this issue, we're talking about grammatical gender identification in this societal gender identification, because I'm always worried people will take my words and put them in different contexts, but it's specifically grammar. And here it says, Saida is first feminine, بمعرفتكن, ma'rifa is ambiguous, but the kunna part is feminine. This is when you have something plus something is because of the clitics, which in Arabic, add some complexity. And sayyidat, for example, is second person feminine, but it is without a clitic in that case. And then we had 3 different kind of models that rely on using the data in different ways. So remembering what it saw in the training, having an independent, this is the Corpus rewriter, having a morphological system that we have developed here over the years that does reinflection on Arabic, on standard Arabic, and also a neural model that actually, with these newer technologies that would improve how to actually handle the cases that are the backup cases. So unless we know for sure we've seen the example or we know about how to do it, we would use this additional model. Now that will generate multiple options in some cases. And like, for example, Saeed and Sa'idan is one of the problems of case in Arabic, that some forms will actually show you different possibilities. So we use a language modeling step to select. And this is kind of the flow of this process that gets us about 88% accuracy on the gender ID and the rewriting. So, and we have shown that it does improve machine translation. So I think I'm gonna step out and let Bashar show his demo.
Sounds good. Let me just share my screen real quick. Cool. So hello, everybody. This is Bashar, and as Nizar mentioned, I'm a computer science PhD student at NYU. Right now, you're getting a first glance at the system that we developed to do gender rewriting in Arabic. The system has the ability to basically give the user the option to select the grammatical gender of the users that are involved in a sentence. So in our case, it's going to be a listener and a speaker. We can select if you want, for example, masculine, feminine, but for the purposes of this demo, we're basically selecting all of options to basically show all the combinations of the rewriting. The system takes in either Arabic sentences or English sentences, and in the case of the English, it's going to basically use Google Translate to translate into Arabic and then do the rewriting. So to give you an example of this, say that I have a sentence which Nizar used in his talk, that I'm a doctor and you are a nurse, and I want to translate and rewrite the sentence. We will see that the Google translation output is أنا طبيب وأنت ممرضة. The blue colored words are basically to indicate the speaker, whereas the orange colored words are to indicate the listener. And if we go over all the 4 combinations, if I have a female listener and a female speaker, I would get أنا الطبيبة وأنت ممرضة. If I have a male listener and a female speaker, I would get أنا الطبيبة وأنت ممرض. If I have a female listener and a male speaker, I would get أنا طبيب وأنت ممرضة. And if I have a male listener with a male speaker, I would get أنا طبيب وأنت ممرض. To pick another interesting example that's a little bit more complex in a way, say that the sentence was, I was a lawyer before I became a mother. And if I would like to translate and rewrite this, we would see that the Google Translate output was كنت محامٍ قبل أن أصبحت أم. So in that case, the translation is obviously wrong, even though it had the clue that the person who's speaking is actually a female user. Regardless of that, our system was a little bit robust in a sense that it was able to do the rewriting in a correct way. So in the case of the female listener and the female speaker, the system recognizes that Muhammad was actually masculine and it should be rewritten to feminine. And in the case of a female listener and a male speaker, the sentence, the output was كنت محامٍ قبل أن أصبحت أب. So basically, was turned into أب. Now, if we look at Arabic only examples, and if we look at the corrected version of this English sentence, which is كنت محامية قبل أن أصبحت أمًا, we would see that the system was able to generate all the correct outputs with the correct casing and the grammatical genders based on the specified users. The example that Nizar showed in the presentation, where we have two actual words that shift, where أنا سعيد بعودتك يا عزيزي. In that case, we would get all four possible combinations. أنا سعيدة بعودتك يا عزيزتي، أنا سعيدة بعودتك يا عزيزي، أنا سعيد بعودتك يا عزيزتي, and lastly, أنا سعيد بعودتك يا عزيزي. And last but not least, thank you so much for your attention, and it was a pleasure presenting this demo.
Thank you, Bashar. So as Bashar said, this is actually like really just something that we just put together. Actually, we're trying to submit it to a conference, the demo, and you're getting first look at it. I'm actually would love to hear opinions on how to actually talk about it in Arabic, because we tried to put it in a bilingual way, and we had said, you know, تعديل الصيغ الجنسية في النصوص العربية, which every time you use that J word, it sounds kind of really off in Arabic. So, you know, any advice on how to talk about this in a way that gets the idea something very clever in Arabic, we would definitely appreciate this. But we're thinking of this at least, you know, I mean, it's a very technical academic language for now. So I'm gonna just wrap up quickly, and so thank you for your attention on this. Just maybe the messages to take here is that, you know, bias is something that is structural and pervasive in every aspect of the production of computational linguistics, natural language processing, and AI system that recreate, propagate, and magnify it. Data, algorithms, publishing, education, employment, all of these things are connected with each other, and they kind of continue these patterns. The work that we are doing is basically trying to solve these problems. I mean, although we're focusing on one particular problem, which we, you know, affects 50% of the, you know, Arabic speaking people, right? We think that a lot of the ideas there related to how do you control AI systems and NLP models could also apply in other ways. You know, this kind of work, these resources that we're making public, we believe have a potential of actually changing how we write, read, and teach Arabic, right? Imagine, for example, a bit of sci-fi perhaps right now, that when you go to a website that is written, let's say, we actually had an experience recently, website on advising, you know, leaders in, you know, on how to manage companies, etc. And it was all written in the masculine form, as if there are no female CEOs that could exist. And of course, by writing it that way, they push female CEOs away from this field. But imagine there was a little click somewhere, or the system with its cookies knows, oh, I know you're Ghada, thank you for coming back. I'm gonna just change the text automatically so that it talks to you in a way that you feel comfortable with, if that bothers you or it doesn't bother you, right? Whatever, right? So at least to give people, the users, the options to specify this. And of course, you know, issues of privacy, etc., would become something that we would have to consider as part of this work also. I want to just say a couple of announcements that we're very proud of. This conference of empirical methods in natural language processing, which is the second conference in NLP in the world after the Association for Computational Linguistics Conference. It will be in Abu Dhabi in December this year. So I'm the local chair. We'd love to have you visit us. We are actually running a gender rewriting shared task, a competition. There'll be like 5,000 new sentences that we're commissioning their gender ID and translation, and they will be made public to the community with all of the data that we have to see who can actually do better in this space, to encourage more research on it. There's also other workshops that are happening too, so that are connected with this and also through the year. Finally, if you're interested in this space, consider joining SIG Arab, which is the special interest group on Arabic language processing. This is something that was just started in January this year. There's the link to it. And thank you very much. These are the links, if you want, to the SIG Arab page and also Arabic Parallel Gender Corpus. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to get them.